Imagine being the king of France, the most powerful man in the kingdom, and being terrified of breaking. Yes, breaking. Like your grandma's favorite glass at Thanksgiving dinner. Meet Charles VI, better known as the Glass King. A monarch so fragile, he probably would have worn a helmet to bed and asked to be bubble-wrapped before meetings. While the rest of Europe was busy fighting wars, dying of plague, and launching crusades, Charles was fighting his own personal battle. Not to shatter. Literally. He believed his body was made of glass, and lived in constant fear of cracking into a million pieces. And to make things worse, his kingdom was falling apart too. Civil wars, betrayals, English invasions. Basically, France had turned into one giant glass falling off the table. So sit back, carefully, please, we don't want any accidents, and find out how a medieval king ended up believing he was a walking chandelier. This is the story of Charles VI, the man, the myth, the glass. The good news is that Charles VI of France was crowned king at the tender age of 11, inheriting one of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval Europe, complete with castles, armies, and enough gold to make a dragon jealous. The bad news is that by his mid-20s, he would become convinced that he was literally made of glass and could shatter at any moment, turning one of history's mightiest thrones into what was essentially a very expensive, very awkward therapy session that lasted 3 decades. Born in 1368, Charles seemed destined for greatness, the kind of ruler who'd unite kingdoms and inspire songs. Instead, he'd inspire medical debates that continue to this day and become the poster child for why absolute monarchy maybe wasn't the best system when mental health crises hit. Young Charles started his reign under the guidance of his uncles, who served as regents while he figured out which end of the crown went up. These uncles, naturally, were more interested in lining their own pockets than teaching the kid how to actually run a kingdom, because why focus on boring things like governance when you could be embezzling from the royal treasury? The Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou treated the French royal coffers like their personal ATM machines, withdrawing funds for lavish parties while the peasants outside were eating bread so hard it could double as a weapon. This wasn't exactly the best foundation for young Charles's mental health, watching the adults around him act like kids in a candy store where all the candy was paid for with taxes. By the time Charles took real control at 21, he'd learned that being king meant trusting no one, which is basically medieval leadership 101. When Charles finally assumed personal rule in 1388, he actually showed promise, dismissing his greedy uncles and surrounding himself with capable advisors known as the Marmozettes, which sounds like a boy band, but was actually a group of competent administrators. For a few years, France experienced something resembling functional government, with Charles making reasonable decisions and acting like an actual responsible monarch instead of a crown trust fund baby. He even managed to avoid starting unnecessary wars, which in medieval Europe was like finding a vegetarian at a barbecue competition. Technically possible, but surprisingly rare. The kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief, thinking maybe this whole having a sane king thing would work out after all. Charles proved he could handle diplomatic negotiations, manage the economy without bankrupting everyone, and generally act like someone who deserved a crown instead of a straitjacket. But then 1392 rolled around like a freight train nobody saw coming, and everything went spectacularly wrong in a forest near Le Mans. Charles was leading a military expedition to Brittany when, on a scorching August day, a sleep-deprived leper emerged from the woods and grabbed the king's horse's bridle, shouting warnings about traitors and betrayal. Now, imagine you're already stressed about a military campaign. You haven't slept well, you're wearing metal armor in summer heat that could cook an egg on your helmet, and suddenly a diseased stranger jumps out screaming prophecies at you. Charles completely lost it, drawing his sword and attacking his own knights in a frenzy that lasted 40 minutes, killing 4 men before he was finally subdued and collapsed into unconsciousness. This incident, charmingly known as the Dance of the Burning Men, or sometimes just that time the king went absolutely bananas in the forest, marked the beginning of Charles's descent into madness. When Charles woke up, he had no memory of the incident, which is probably for the best since, remember that time you murdered your own bodyguards? Isn't great conversation material. For several months, he seemed relatively normal, and everyone hoped it was just a one-time stress-induced breakdown. like a medieval version of a really bad day at the office where instead of sending an angry email, you accidentally commit regicide. But the episodes kept returning, each time pulling Charles further from reality and deeper into delusions that would define his reign and make his courtiers wonder if maybe those greedy uncles weren't so bad after all. Between episodes, Charles could be completely lucid, discussing politics and making decisions, which made the whole situation even more disturbing because nobody knew when the next break would happen. It was like living with a time bomb that occasionally gave lectures on fiscal policy before exploding into complete psychological chaos. The glass delusion, when it finally manifested, wasn't Charles's first rodeo with bizarre beliefs. During various episodes, he didn't recognize his wife or children, forgot he was king entirely, and once believed he was St. George, which at least had some heroic cachet to it. He would run through the palace corridors howling like a wolf, refused to bathe for months, and according to some accounts, needed to be physically restrained to prevent him from hurting himself during particularly severe episodes. But the glass delusion was special, a persistent belief that lasted for years and required the entire French court to completely restructure royal protocols around one man's conviction that he was essentially a very expensive, very fragile wine goblet with a crown. Charles became convinced that if anyone touched him, or if he moved too suddenly, he would shatter into 1,000 pieces, turning every day at the French court into an elaborate game of don't break the king. The palace staff had to get creative, because how do you run a kingdom when your monarch thinks he's made of a material that breaks if you sneeze near it? They sewed iron rods into Charles's clothing to reinforce him, which probably didn't help his comfort level, but gave him enough psychological security to occasionally leave his chambers. His attendants had to approach him like bomb disposal experts approaching an explosive device, moving slowly, speaking softly, and definitely not making any sudden movements that might cause His Majesty to panic about potential shattering. Furniture was padded, floors were carpeted with extra layers, and everyone in the court had to pretend that yes, absolutely, treating the king like he was made of delicate glass was completely normal and definitely not a sign that maybe France needed to rethink its political structure. Charles would stand still for hours, afraid that movement would cause cracks, which made governing somewhat difficult since most kingly duties involve at least a modicum of physical activity beyond statue impression. Meanwhile, France was technically still a country that needed running, which presented some logistical challenges when your chief executive was convinced he was a fragile art installation. The power vacuum created by Charles's condition turned into a free-for-all among the nobility, with various factions fighting for control like vultures circling a particularly confused carcass. His brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, began a rivalry so intense it eventually erupted into civil war, proving that the only thing worse than having a mad king was having ambitious relatives who saw that madness as a career opportunity. The common people, already dealing with the 100 Years' War with England, plague outbreaks, and the usual medieval difficulties of not dying before 30, now had to add, "Our king thinks he's glassware," to their list of problems. Charles's wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to maintain some semblance of authority, but coordinating government policy while your husband refuses to move because he might shatter is like trying to steer a ship when the captain has locked himself in his cabin convinced he's made of porcelain. The medical community of the time was absolutely baffled, which isn't surprising given that medieval medicine thought most problems could be solved with bloodletting, prayer, and the occasional application of leeches. Doctors debated whether Charles's condition was caused by sorcery, demonic possession, an imbalance of humors, or possibly bad mushrooms, covering basically every explanation except the actual psychological disorder that was obviously happening. Some physicians recommended exorcisms, others suggested more bleeding, and a few proposed special diets, because apparently medieval doctors believed that eating the right combination of foods could cure the delusion that you're made of glass. None of it worked, obviously, because treating serious mental illness with medieval medical knowledge was like trying to fix a computer with a hammer and good intentions. The king continued his glass delusion, and France continued its slow descent into political chaos, proving that sometimes a country's problems are too big to be solved by leeches, no matter how many you apply. Treatment attempts range from the merely useless to the actively dangerous, with Charles subjected to everything medieval medicine could throw at someone while carefully not touching them too hard lest they believe they'd shattered. Monks prayed over him, doctors bled him, and courtiers tried various forms of shock therapy that mostly just traumatized everyone involved without improving the king's condition whatsoever. One particularly ambitious physician suggested that Charles could be cured by witnessing childbirth, operating on the medieval medical theory that was essentially, have you tried seeing something weird and unrelated to your problem? Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and now everyone involved had to pretend that making the king watch someone give birth was a totally reasonable medical intervention. The French court became a bizarre experimental laboratory where every crackpot theory got a chance to fail publicly, all while the king stood very still in his iron-reinforced clothing, convinced that any moment could be his last before shattering into royal shards across the palace floor. Between his episodes of madness, Charles experienced periods of clarity that were somehow even more tragic than the delusions themselves. During these lucid intervals, he was fully aware of his condition, understood the chaos his illness had caused, and felt profound despair about his inability to rule effectively or be a proper husband and father. Imagine having moments where you suddenly realize you've spent months convinced you were made of glass, that your kingdom has descended into civil war because of your inability to govern, and that everyone around you has to treat you like a very important piece of china that occasionally talks. These lucid periods didn't last long enough for Charles to actually fix anything, but lasted just long enough for him to comprehend the full horror of his situation before sliding back into delusion, which is perhaps the cruelest aspect of his entire story. He would apologize to his family, try to address matters of state, and then, just when it seemed things might improve, the madness would return, and he'd be back to standing perfectly still, terrified of his own fragility that existed only in his mind. Charles's glass delusion wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became a national security crisis wrapped in a psychiatric disorder, because nothing says vulnerable geopolitical position quite like having your head of state convinced he's a breakable decorative object during a major international war. England, still embroiled with France in the 100 Years' War, watched these developments with the kind of glee usually reserved for finding out your rival's house has termites, except instead of termites, it was complete governmental dysfunction caused by royal insanity. The English saw Charles's condition as divine proof that God favored their claim to the French throne, because medieval logic dictated that if your enemy's king thought he was glass, clearly the Almighty was making a statement about your legitimacy. French nobles, meanwhile, had to conduct diplomacy and military strategy while pretending their king wasn't standing in the corner of the throne room, motionless, wrapped in padded clothing and convinced that a strong breeze might shatter him into 1,000 pieces. The Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Burgundy turned Charles's incapacity into their personal playground for a power struggle that would make modern political drama look like a polite disagreement about parking spaces. Louis of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, essentially ran the kingdom during the king's episodes while also having an affair with Queen Isabeau, because apparently one medieval scandal at a time wasn't enough for this family. John the Fearless of Burgundy, not to be outdone in the let's make everything worse competition, had Louis assassinated in 1407, sparking a civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions that would ravage France for decades. So now France had a mad king who thought he was glass, a murdered duke, a potentially adulterous queen, and two noble factions literally killing each other in the streets while England watched from across the channel, probably making popcorn. The common people, caught in the crossfire of both civil war and international conflict, must have wondered what they'd done to deserve a royal family that made Greek tragedies look like feel-good comedies. Charles's wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, deserves either immense sympathy or a Medal of Honor for dealing with impossible situations, depending on which historical account you believe. She married Charles when she was 14, watched him descend into madness within a few years, bore him 12 children while he intermittently didn't recognize her, and somehow had to maintain royal dignity while her husband stood perfectly still in iron-reinforced pants. Isabeau tried to act as regent during Charles's worst episodes, making her one of the few women wielding significant political power in medieval France. though this achievement is somewhat dampened by the fact that she got the job because her husband thought he was fragile glassware. Later historians would accuse her of everything from adultery to treason to deliberately keeping Charles mad so she could maintain power, because apparently medieval chroniclers believed the appropriate response to a woman in authority was to assume she must be evil. Whether Isabeau was a villain, a victim, or simply someone doing her best in an utterly impossible situation remains debated, but one thing's certain: her marriage was definitely not what she signed up for at 14. The children of Charles and Isabeau grew up in what can only be described as a deeply dysfunctional royal household, where "take your son to work day" meant watching your father stand motionless for hours because he was afraid of breaking. The Dauphin Charles, their son and heir, spent his formative years watching his father's madness, his mother's controversial regency, and his uncles murdering each other over political power, which is basically a masterclass in how to traumatize future rulers. Several of Charles VI's children died young, whether from medieval medicine, plague, or simply giving up on a family situation that resembled a particularly dark theater production where all the actors had lost the script. The surviving children had to navigate a court where nobody knew if the king would be lucid or delusional on any given day, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty that makes modern dysfunctional families look positively stable by comparison. Young Charles, the future Charles VII, would eventually have to reclaim France from English occupation with Joan of Arc's help, proving that sometimes generational trauma manifests as having to reconquer your own kingdom because your dad thought he was glass and everyone took advantage of it. The Dance of the Burning Men, incident of 1393, not to be confused with Charles's initial breakdown, added another layer of horror to this already nightmarish situation. During a masquerade ball intended to cheer up the melancholy king, Charles and 5 courtiers dressed up as wild men, covered in linen soaked in resin and covered with flax to look hairy. Someone, accounts vary on who, brought a torch too close to the dancers, and 4 of them literally burned to death in their costumes while the court watched in horror, because apparently medieval party planning didn't include basic fire safety protocols. Charles only survived because the Duchess of Berry threw her skirt over him to smother the flames, meaning he escaped death by medieval costume fire only to continue his life convinced he was made of glass, which honestly might have made him wonder if burning to death would have been simpler. This incident deepened Charles's psychological problems, adding trauma to madness and giving his attendants yet another thing to worry about when planning royal entertainment, like, make sure we don't accidentally immolate the king, became an actual item on the royal event checklist. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented perhaps the lowest point of Charles's reign, when his own government essentially signed away France to England because everyone had given up on the glass king ever recovering. This treaty declared that Henry V of England would marry Charles's daughter Catherine and inherit the French throne after Charles's death, completely disinheriting the Dauphin and basically saying, "We're so done with this mad king situation that we're willing to just hand the kingdom to the English." Charles, during one of his lucid moments, reportedly wept when he understood what had been done in his name, though whether he actually comprehended that his mental illness had led to his kingdom being given away or whether this was another delusion is debated by historians. The treaty was signed at the royal residence in Troyes, with Charles present but essentially reduced to a royal rubber stamp, his signature on the document that gave away French sovereignty obtained while he was too mentally impaired to possibly consent in any meaningful way. It's like signing a contract while someone is heavily sedated and then claiming it's totally legitimate because technically they held the pen. Living with the glass delusion meant Charles's daily routine became an elaborate performance art piece where everyone pretended that treating the monarch like he was one wrong move away from becoming a pile of shards was completely normal. His attendants developed an entire protocol for dressing him, moving him, feeding him, and conducting state business around his conviction that he was fragile beyond measure, essentially creating a bubble-wrap monarchy. Charles would sometimes allow himself to be moved if convinced that his reinforcements were properly in place, the iron rods in his clothing providing psychological comfort even though they did absolutely nothing to address his actual mental health crisis. Other times, he'd refuse to move at all, standing or sitting in one position for days, requiring the court to come to him rather than expecting the king to come to them, which must have made diplomatic receptions incredibly awkward when visiting dignitaries had to approach the motionless, padded king like he was a very important museum exhibit. The sheer amount of resources, time, and human energy devoted to managing one man's delusion while France burned around him represents a stunning indictment of absolute monarchy as a system of government. The glass delusion, interestingly, wasn't unique to Charles VI, though he remains its most famous sufferer and the only case where the delusion affected an entire kingdom's political stability. Medieval and early modern medical texts describe other cases of people convinced they were made of glass, suggesting this was a recognized psychiatric phenomenon of the era, possibly related to the introduction of glass as a luxury material that was simultaneously beautiful, valuable, and extremely fragile. Some historians theorize that the glass delusion represented a manifestation of anxiety about social status and vulnerability, with sufferers unconsciously expressing their psychological fragility through the metaphor of glass, which is actually pretty poetic if you ignore the devastating political consequences. Charles's case was so well documented that it influenced medical and philosophical discussions for centuries, with René Descartes even mentioning the possibility of someone believing they're made of glass in his meditations as an example of extreme delusion. So congratulations, Charles. You were so memorably mad that you made it into foundational philosophical texts about the nature of reality and knowledge, which is probably not the legacy most kings hope for. The religious response to Charles's condition reveals medieval Christianity's complicated relationship with mental illness, which ranged from compassionate to completely insane depending on who you asked. Some clergy interpreted Charles's madness as demonic possession requiring exorcism, leading to numerous attempts to cast out demons from a king who was actually suffering from what modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose as schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Other religious figures saw Charles's condition as divine punishment for France's sins, which must have been really comforting to the king during his lucid moments. Hey, your debilitating mental illness is actually God punishing the entire country for moral failings. Pilgrimages were organized, relics were brought to the king's bedside, and saints were petitioned for intervention, none of which helped because psychological disorders don't respond to prayer any more than broken legs heal through meditation. The church's inability to cure Charles despite years of spiritual intervention didn't shake medieval faith in religious healing. It just meant more prayers were needed, creating a theological feedback loop where failure to cure proved insufficient devotion rather than ineffective methodology. Charles's condition persisted until his death in 1422, meaning he spent 30 years as a mad king, with periods of lucidity becoming increasingly rare as he aged and his mental state deteriorated further. By the end, he was virtually unrecognizable from the promising young monarch who had taken personal control of France decades earlier, transformed into a tragic figure who spent most of his time in isolation, forgotten by his own family, and abandoned by nobles who had moved on to fighting over his kingdom's remains. The man who once ruled one of Europe's most powerful nations died having witnessed his realm torn apart by civil war, partially conquered by England, and reduced to chaos because no adequate system existed to handle a monarch's complete mental breakdown. Charles VI died at age 53, which was actually pretty old for medieval times, meaning he survived for decades with a condition that in any just world would have resulted in compassionate care and removal from power, but instead resulted in him being used as a puppet by various factions while convinced he might shatter at any moment. His death was almost a relief, ending 3 decades of madness that had defined French politics and destroyed countless lives caught in the chaos his illness enabled. The financial cost of maintaining a glass king was astronomical, though nobody at the time thought to create a line item in the royal budget labeled "expenses related to pretending His Majesty won't shatter." The French treasury, already strained by the 100 Years' War, had to fund specialized clothing with iron reinforcements, extra padding for every surface Charles might encounter, and salaries for attendants trained in the delicate art of moving a monarch who believed physical contact could be fatal. Meanwhile, the actual business of governance, defending borders, collecting taxes, administering justice, became secondary to managing one man's delusion, which is essentially like a modern corporation spending all its resources on making sure the CEO's imaginary friend is comfortable while the company burns down around them. The irony wasn't lost on French taxpayers, who were funding both a war with England and an elaborate theatrical production centered on their king's psychiatric condition, though complaining about it could get you executed for treason. So mostly people just suffered in silence and hoped things would somehow improve. Charles's delusion affected military strategy in ways that would be hilarious if they weren't so catastrophically tragic for France's defense against English invasion. Generals couldn't consult with their king about troop movements or battle plans because approaching him might trigger a panic attack about potential shattering. And written correspondence was complicated by Charles's intermittent inability to read, recognize people, or remember he was king at all. The French military essentially operated without central command, with various nobles making autonomous decisions that sometimes contradicted each other, creating a battlefield coordination nightmare that gave England significant advantages despite France's superior numbers and resources. English commanders must have felt like they were playing chess against an opponent who occasionally forgot the rules mid-game, moved pieces randomly, and sometimes insisted the board itself was trying to kill them. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415, one of England's greatest victories, occurred during Charles's reign when French forces were so poorly coordinated due to civil war and absent royal leadership that they managed to lose despite outnumbering the English by large margins, proving that having a mad king is bad, but having a mad king during a major war is absolutely catastrophic. The glass delusion created bizarre diplomatic situations when foreign ambassadors had to present credentials to a king who couldn't be touched and might not remember meeting them 5 minutes later. Imagine being an envoy from another kingdom, traveling for weeks to reach Paris, preparing elaborate speeches and gifts, only to be told you must approach the French king very slowly, not make sudden movements, definitely not extend your hand for a greeting, and speak to him like he's a temperamental museum artifact that might explode if startled. Some ambassadors reported that Charles would simply stare at them blankly, unresponsive, while courtiers awkwardly tried to conduct diplomacy around a monarch who was physically present but mentally absent, like the world's worst video conference where the host's camera is on, but they've clearly left the room. Other times, Charles would be lucid enough to conduct business, creating a diplomatic lottery where success depended entirely on whether you caught the king on a good day or a convinced he's made of glass day. Foreign powers learned to bypass Charles entirely, negotiating with whichever duke or regent currently held actual power, effectively reducing the French monarchy to decorative status while the king stood motionless in his reinforced clothing, a living symbol of governmental dysfunction. The servants and attendants who spent decades caring for Charles deserve historical recognition for what must have been the most psychologically demanding job in medieval Europe. These individuals had to maintain absolute composure while pretending their daily routine of treating a grown man like a fragile vase was perfectly normal, all while knowing that France was collapsing around them, and their king's condition was the catalyst for much of that collapse. They developed elaborate strategies for everything from helping Charles eat without him panicking about breaking, to moving him between rooms, to handling his personal hygiene during periods when he refused to bathe, because water might somehow damage his supposed glass composition. Some attendants spent their entire careers in service to Charles's delusion, growing old alongside a king who never recovered, their lives defined by accommodating one man's psychiatric crisis while the kingdom burned. The psychological toll on these servants, watching someone suffer for decades, knowing nothing you do actually helps, maintaining a fiction that everyone knows is false, must have been immense, though medieval sources don't record their feelings because apparently only kings' trauma mattered enough to document. Queen Isabeau's attempts to maintain some form of normalcy for their children while Charles stood motionless in another room, convinced he was glass, represents a peculiar form of medieval single parenting. She had to explain to her kids why their father sometimes didn't recognize them, why he couldn't play with them or hold them, and why the entire palace revolved around not disturbing the king who might not emerge from his chambers for weeks. The younger children barely knew their father as anything other than the strange man who had to be approached carefully and might suddenly start screaming about breaking, which is definitely not the father-child bonding experience anyone hopes for. Isabeau organized separate household routines, celebrations, and daily life that excluded Charles entirely during his worst episodes, essentially running two parallel royal families. One centered on the Mad King, another centered on everyone else trying to live despite the Mad King. Birthday parties, religious holidays, and family dinners all had to be planned around whether Charles was currently lucid, currently delusional, or currently standing perfectly still in his room, convinced that movement equaled destruction, making the phrase dysfunctional family seem woefully inadequate to describe the situation. The propaganda war surrounding Charles's condition reveals medieval spin, doctors working overtime to control the narrative about their glass king. French loyalists emphasized Charles's lucid periods, claiming his illness was temporary and treatable, while minimizing the reality that he spent most of his reign incapacitated by delusions. English propagandists had a field day, producing pamphlets and songs mocking the French king, who thought he was breakable, using Charles's condition as proof that God favored England's claim to France, because clearly the Almighty wouldn't allow a legitimate king to go completely insane. Burgundian faction propaganda portrayed Charles as too mad to rule and suggested that maybe someone else, coincidentally a Burgundian, should take over, while Armagnac propaganda insisted Charles was fine and definitely didn't need replacing by Burgundian usurpers. Thank you very much. The truth, that Charles was severely mentally ill and needed compassionate medical care rather than being used as a political football, got lost in all the competing narratives, because apparently even a king's obvious suffering can be weaponized if people try hard enough. Charles's glass delusion intersected with medieval beliefs about the divine right of kings in philosophically interesting and practically disastrous ways. If kings ruled by God's will and represented divine authority on earth, what did it mean when God's chosen representative thought he was made of glass? Some theologians argued that Charles's condition was a test of French faith, while others suggested it proved that even divinely appointed monarchs were subject to earthly afflictions, accidentally stumbling into progressive theological territory by acknowledging that maybe kings were just humans after all. The fact that nobody seriously considered removing Charles from power despite 3 decades of obvious incapacity demonstrates how deeply medieval society was invested in the divine right theory. Even a king who couldn't function was still theoretically preferable to the chaos of succession battles or, God forbid, suggesting that monarchical power wasn't absolute. So France endured 30 years of dysfunction because the alternative, admitting that their governmental system had a fatal flaw when the monarch went mad, was philosophically and politically unthinkable, which is basically like refusing to evacuate a burning building because leaving would mean admitting your fire safety plan was inadequate. The medical records and chronicles describing Charles's treatment read like a catalog of medieval medicine's greatest misses, which is saying something given that medieval medicine was generally more likely to kill you than cure you. Physicians tried bloodletting to balance his humors, which just made Charles weaker and more vulnerable to additional psychological distress. They prescribed special diets, herbal remedies, and potions that ranged from useless to actively toxic, all while insisting that the treatments were working and Charles just needed more time to recover. Some doctors recommended trepanation, drilling holes in Charles's skull to release evil spirits. But apparently, even medieval physicians recognized this might be a bad idea for someone already convinced he was fragile, though the fact that they considered it at all is terrifying. The sheer number of failed treatments, each confidently prescribed by physicians who claimed expertise they clearly didn't possess, turned Charles into a guinea pig for every crackpot medical theory of the era. Modern readers might feel superior about medieval medical ignorance until remembering that our own psychiatric care has only relatively recently moved beyond lobotomies and insulin shock therapy, suggesting that perhaps medical hubris is a timeless human trait. The intersection of Charles's personal tragedy with broader French political collapse created a feedback loop where each problem exacerbated the others. His madness created power vacuums that noble factions exploited. Their fighting deepened the chaos that stressed Charles and worsened his condition, which created more power vacuums, in a vicious cycle that nearly destroyed France as a political entity. The assassination of Louis of Orleans triggered civil war, which prevented unified resistance against England, which led to military disasters like Agincourt, which increased pressure on the already dysfunctional royal government, which had no way to respond effectively because its king was standing very still, trying not to shatter. By the time the Treaty of Troyes gave France to England in 1420, the kingdom had effectively ceased to function as a coherent state, fractured into competing territories controlled by various factions, with the legitimate government reduced to whatever decisions could be made around a king who might or might not be lucid on any given day. Charles's personal psychiatric crisis had become France's national nightmare, demonstrating how medieval governmental systems were catastrophically vulnerable to single points of failure, especially when that single point was the king's mental health. Entertainment and distraction were prescribed as treatments for Charles's condition, operating on the medieval medical theory that sad or mad people just needed to cheer up, which is about as effective as it sounds. Courtiers organized elaborate performances, musical concerts, and feasts intended to improve the king's mood, though these events had to be carefully managed to avoid anything that might trigger panic about breaking. No juggling near the king, no sudden loud noises, definitely no dancing too close to His Majesty. The Dance of the Burning Men disaster proved that entertaining a delusional king was more dangerous than therapeutic, but that didn't stop people from trying, because admitting that entertainment couldn't cure serious mental illness would require acknowledging that medieval medicine had no idea what it was doing. Charles would sometimes watch performances from a special padded chair positioned far from other guests, a solitary figure observing festivities he couldn't join, which is perhaps the loneliest image in this entire sad story. Other times he'd refuse to attend entirely, remaining in his chambers convinced that the vibrations from music and dancing might cause him to crack, turning royal celebrations into events that happened around the king's absence rather than his presence, like throwing a birthday party where the birthday person is locked in another room, convinced they're made of glass. The bureaucratic nightmare of running a kingdom when official documents required royal approval, but your monarch thought he was breakable created an entire shadow government of workarounds and forgeries. Ministers would obtain Charles's signature during lucid moments for stacks of blank documents to be filled in later, essentially creating authorized forgeries for when the king was unavailable due to glass delusion. Other times, officials simply forged Charles's signature entirely, reasoning that fake approval from a mad king was functionally identical to real approval from a mad king, both being equally meaningless in terms of actual royal decision-making. The French bureaucracy became remarkably creative at governing without effective royal participation, developing systems and precedents that would influence absolute monarchy for centuries, essentially learning how to run a kingdom when the absolute monarch was absolutely incapable. This accidental administrative innovation proved more durable than anything Charles accomplished during his lucid periods, which is ironic. The Mad King's greatest contribution to French governance was forcing his ministers to figure out how to work around him, accidentally creating institutional resilience by being so utterly unreliable that the system had to function independently. The court physicians eventually gave up on curing Charles and shifted to what modern medicine would call management, which in medieval terms meant, let's just try to keep him alive and reasonably calm while France falls apart. This pragmatic surrender to reality took years to achieve because admitting defeat meant acknowledging that all their bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers had accomplished absolutely nothing except possibly making Charles's condition worse. The doctors established routines designed to minimize triggers for his glass delusion, consistent daily schedules, familiar attendance, controlled environments, essentially inventing medieval psychiatric care through trial and error while pretending they were still working toward a cure. Medical reports from this period read like elaborate exercises in creative writing, describing improvements and progress that anyone with eyes could see were non-existent, because apparently even in the 15th century, medical professionals couldn't admit they were completely stumped without losing credibility. The physicians became glorified babysitters, monitoring Charles's moods and physical health while the actual business of governance happened elsewhere. Their presence maintained more for appearances than any therapeutic value they provided. Charles's relationship with his children during his illness ranged from non-existent to traumatic, depending on which phase of madness he was experiencing at any given time. His eldest son, Louis, died young, possibly poisoned during the factional struggles. Though some historians suggest the stress of having a mad father might have contributed to whatever illness killed him, because apparently living in constant political danger while your dad thinks he's glass is bad for your health. The future Charles VII, born in 1403, grew up knowing his father primarily as a cautionary tale rather than a parent. Their relationship defined by absence and occasional disturbing encounters when young Charles would be brought to see his father and the king wouldn't recognize his own son. Imagine being a child, told you're going to visit your father the king, and finding instead a man in bizarre padded clothing who stares at you blankly, or, worse, recoils in terror that you might touch him and cause him to shatter. The psychological damage inflicted on an entire generation of royal children by Charles's condition ripples through French history, as these traumatized kids grew up to be the leaders who would have to salvage France from the disaster their father's reign had become. The succession crisis created by Charles's madness but continued living became its own special nightmare, because medieval succession depended on the king actually dying, not just being functionally dead while technically alive. The Dauphin couldn't take power while Charles lived, creating a legal limbo where France had a legitimate heir who couldn't rule and a legitimate king who couldn't rule, leaving actual governance to whoever could grab power and hold it long enough. This situation was tailor-made for ambitious nobles to exploit, each claiming they were helping the king while actually enriching themselves and their factions. Young Charles, the Dauphin, found himself declared illegitimate by his own mother in the Treaty of Troyes, whether through coercion or political calculation, adding parental betrayal to the long list of traumas he collected during his father's reign. The legal fiction that Charles VI remained France's rightful king even while giving the kingdom to England created paradoxes that lawyers and chroniclers struggled to explain, essentially arguing that yes, the Mad King was still king, but also yes, we're giving his kingdom away, and somehow both these things are legitimate and don't contradict each other at all. Daily life in the palace during Charles's worst periods resembled a very expensive mental institution that occasionally pretended to be a seat of government. Entire wings of royal residences were modified to accommodate Charles's delusion, with padded corridors, reinforced furniture, and designated safe spaces where the king could remain without fearing accidental breakage. The palace staff developed specialized skills unique to this situation: how to dress a person who believes they're glass, how to move someone who can't be touched, how to maintain a straight face while participating in elaborate theater designed to accommodate delusions everyone knew weren't real. Visiting nobles and ambassadors who hadn't been briefed on proper protocols would sometimes make mistakes, reaching out to shake Charles's hand or approaching too quickly, triggering panic attacks that could last hours and required the entire household to manage the aftermath. The palace became a place where normal human interaction was suspended, replaced by carefully choreographed performances where everyone played their assigned role in maintaining the king's delusional reality, turning one of Europe's grandest courts into what was essentially a very expensive psychiatric ward with crowns. Charles's periodic lucid moments were almost crueler than his consistent madness because they gave false hope that recovery might be possible while actually just providing windows into his suffering. During these clear periods, Charles would weep over what had become of his kingdom, apologize to his family for his condition, and try desperately to address the backlog of governmental business that had accumulated during his episodes. But lucidity never lasted long enough to actually fix anything meaningful. He might have a few days or weeks of clarity, but France's problems required years of consistent leadership to address, and Charles couldn't provide consecutive months of sanity, let alone years. These lucid intervals also meant Charles had to live with the knowledge of his condition, understanding that at any moment he might slip back into believing he was glass, watching his attendants' faces for signs they thought he was becoming delusional again, existing in a state of constant anxiety about his own mental state. Imagine knowing you have a condition that makes you believe something completely irrational, having moments where you recognize how irrational it is, but being unable to prevent yourself from believing it again when the next episode hits. That's not just mental illness. That's a special kind of hell that Charles experienced repeatedly for 30 years. The religious community remained divided on whether Charles's condition was a curse, a test, or simply inexplicable divine will, creating theological debates that accomplished nothing except giving scholars something to argue about while France burned. Mystics and visionaries claimed to have received messages from God about Charles's condition, each conveniently supporting whatever political faction that mystic belonged to, because apparently divine revelation in medieval France was remarkably aligned with partisan interests. Some monasteries specialized in prayers for the king's recovery, essentially becoming medieval mental health advocacy organizations, though their success rate was 0% and nobody seemed to notice or care. Saints were petitioned, relics were brought to Charles's bedside, and pilgrimages were undertaken, all operating on the assumption that if they just found the right saint or the right prayer or the right relic, surely God would cure the king, completely missing the point that maybe psychiatric conditions require medical treatment rather than religious intervention. The fact that 30 years of prayer didn't cure Charles didn't shake medieval faith. It just meant they needed to pray harder or differently, creating a theological hamster wheel where failure only justified more of the same failed approach. The economic impact of Charles's reign on ordinary French people was catastrophic, combining war taxation, civil war destruction, and the costs of maintaining an elaborate governmental fiction around a mad king. Peasants paid taxes to fund armies that fought each other rather than defending France, to support a court that accomplished nothing except managing royal delusions, and to finance the competing noble factions whose power struggles devastated the countryside. The 100 Years' War would have been difficult enough with competent leadership. With a glass king, it became an existential threat that nearly erased France as an independent nation. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations decimated by armies that were theoretically all French but spent more time fighting each other than their English enemies, all while their king stood motionless in his palace, convinced that movement might shatter him. The ordinary people of France, who had no say in their government and no ability to change their situation, paid the price for a political system that placed absolute power in one person's hands and had no backup plan when that person went completely mad, proving that absolute monarchy works great until it catastrophically doesn't. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, enabled by Charles's incapacity, killed more French people than the English ever did during this period, turning the Glass King's reign into a fratricidal nightmare. The Armagnacs supported the Dauphin Charles and represented traditional royal authority, while the Burgundians allied with England and controlled much of northern France, both sides claiming legitimacy from a king too mad to actually legitimate anything. Battles between these factions devastated French territories, with each side massacring the other's supporters, burning towns, and committing atrocities that would have been war crimes if medieval people had invented that concept yet. The Burgundian massacre of Armagnac supporters in Paris in 1418 killed thousands, turning the capital into a charnel house, while Charles VI remained isolated in one of his palaces, perhaps aware of the slaughter happening in his name, perhaps convinced he was glass, perhaps both simultaneously in some horrific combination of lucidity and delusion. The Civil War only ended when Charles VII, the son who grew up watching his father's madness destroy France, finally retook the kingdom with Joan of Arc's help years after Charles VI's death, meaning the Glass King's legacy was a civil war that outlived him and nearly destroyed the nation he'd been born to rule. Cultural representations of Charles's madness in chronicles and literature reveal how contemporaries struggled to explain what they were witnessing, lacking any framework for understanding serious mental illness beyond demonic possession or divine punishment. Some chroniclers portrayed Charles sympathetically as a tragic figure suffering through no fault of his own, while others suggested his condition was punishment for royal sins or national moral failings, because medieval people couldn't conceive of mental illness as just a thing that happens without cosmic significance. The more salacious accounts included rumors about Charles's sexual conduct, Isabeau's alleged affairs, and various scandals, because apparently even when documenting unprecedented royal mental illness, medieval chroniclers couldn't resist adding some spicy gossip to keep things interesting. These written records, our primary sources for understanding Charles's condition, are filtered through medieval assumptions, political biases, and the limitations of people trying to describe psychiatric symptoms without any psychiatric vocabulary, making it simultaneously our best evidence and deeply unreliable testimony. Modern historians reading these accounts have to decode medieval language, separate propaganda from observation, and translate descriptions like "the king believed himself to be glass" into modern diagnostic categories, essentially playing historical detective with source material written by people who thought demons and humors explained mental illness. The palace intrigues during Charles's reign make modern political scandals look wholesome by comparison, with various factions using the king's incapacity to justify every imaginable power grab and betrayal. Ministers forged documents in the king's name, made decisions supposedly reflecting royal will that actually reflected their own interests, and manipulated access to Charles during his lucid periods to obtain approvals for schemes he might not have agreed to if fully informed. The Queen was accused of adultery, poisoning, and deliberately keeping Charles mad, though these accusations came from her political enemies and probably say more about medieval misogyny than Isabeau's actual conduct. Nobles switched factions like people change clothes, each betrayal justified by claims they were acting in the king's true interests, as if a man who thought he was glass could have coherent interests beyond not shattering. The royal court became a snake pit where survival required political acumen, ruthlessness, and the ability to pretend that the insanity surrounding you was completely normal, essentially training a generation of French nobles in the arts of manipulation, betrayal, and creative interpretation of royal authority that would influence French politics for generations. Charles's impact on medieval medical understanding of mental illness was surprisingly limited despite 3 decades of well-documented insanity at the highest level of society. Physicians treated his case as unique rather than as an example of conditions that might affect others, missing the opportunity to develop broader understanding of psychiatric disorders. The glass delusion, while documented in other cases, remained a curiosity rather than a recognized syndrome requiring systematic study and treatment protocols. Medieval medicine's fundamental frameworks, humoral theory, divine causation, demonic possession, remained unchanged by Charles's case because these frameworks were unfalsifiable. Any evidence that contradicted them could be explained away rather than prompting theoretical revision. So France spent 30 years with the world's most documented case of serious mental illness, produced volumes of records about the king's condition and failed treatments, and learned essentially nothing that improved care for anyone else suffering similar conditions. This represents a stunning failure of medieval science to learn from observation, though calling it science is generous given that actual scientific method wouldn't emerge for another few centuries, and medieval natural philosophy was more interested in fitting observations into existing theories than revising theories based on observations. The parallel governments that emerged during Charles's madness, the official court centered around the Glass King and the actual power structures operating independently, created a bizarre political theater where everyone knew the performance was fake but had to pretend otherwise. Official documents still bore Charles's name and seal, obtained through various legitimate and illegitimate means, maintaining the legal fiction that royal authority flowed from the king even when everyone knew Charles hadn't made a conscious decision in months. Ministers would brief the king during lucid moments, obtain his theoretical approval for decisions already implemented, and then cite that approval as justification when the next crisis emerged and Charles was back to believing he was breakable. This elaborate charade required tremendous effort to maintain, with scribes, lawyers, and administrators working overtime to ensure proper documentation existed even when the documented reality bore no resemblance to actual events. The French bureaucracy essentially invented modern governmental continuity procedures by necessity, developing systems that allowed governance to continue despite executive incapacity, though they did it while pretending the executive was perfectly fine and definitely not standing motionless in another room, convinced he was made of glass. Charles's few attempts to actually govern during lucid periods were sabotaged by the very people supposedly supporting his authority, because various factions had grown comfortable with the power vacuum and didn't want a functional king interfering with their schemes. When Charles tried to reconcile the Armagnac and Burgundian factions during a period of clarity, both sides smiled, nodded, agreed to peace, and then immediately resumed fighting the moment the king's attention wavered or his next episode began. Orders issued during Charles's lucid periods would be ignored, reinterpreted, or actively contradicted by nobles who claimed the king wasn't actually lucid or didn't understand the situation properly, essentially gaslighting their own monarch. The tragic irony was that Charles's genuine attempts to help his kingdom were less effective than his complete absence, because at least when he was fully incapacitated, the various factions had established working arrangements, whereas his intermittent involvement disrupted these arrangements without being consistent enough to establish alternative governance. Charles's reign proved that in politics, predictable incompetence is often preferable to unpredictable semi-competence, because people can work around consistent dysfunction but can't plan around someone who's sometimes functional and sometimes convinced they're a fragile decorative object. The role of Charles's mother, Joanna of Bourbon, who died when he was young, became fodder for speculation about whether his madness was hereditary or environmental. Medieval chroniclers, lacking genetic knowledge, nevertheless noted that mental instability seemed to run in families, observing that Charles's maternal grandfather had exhibited odd behaviors, though whether this was actual mental illness or just medieval weirdness is debatable. Modern historians and psychiatrists have attempted retroactive diagnosis, suggesting everything from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder to temporal lobe epilepsy, all complicated by the fact that we're working from medieval descriptions written by people who thought the brain's purpose was cooling the blood. The nature versus nurture question is particularly thorny for Charles. Did he inherit a predisposition to mental illness? Or did the trauma of watching his uncles loot the kingdom, the stress of early kingship, and the 1392 incident trigger a condition that might have remained dormant under different circumstances? We'll never know, but medieval people certainly had opinions, most of them wrong but confidently expressed, proving that speculating about other people's mental health without proper expertise is a timeless human tradition. The artistic and cultural output of Charles's reign reflects the chaos and despair of living through governmental collapse caused by royal madness. Illuminated manuscripts from this period show increasingly dark themes. Religious art emphasized suffering and apocalyptic imagery, and literature fixated on betrayal, madness, and the fragility of human reason and political order. Christine de Pizan, a contemporary writer, documented the suffering of ordinary people during the civil wars and lamented the kingdom's collapse, though she had to be careful not to directly criticize the king because treason charges were always a possibility, even when your king thought he was glass. The period's cultural artifacts suggest a society processing collective trauma, trying to make meaning from senseless suffering, and grappling with the realization that their entire political system could be destroyed by one person's mental illness. Art historians note the prevalence of shattered or broken objects in French art from this era, possibly unconscious references to their broken king, though medieval artists weren't exactly subtle with their symbolism, so it might have been completely conscious commentary they hoped wouldn't get them executed for lèse-majesté. Charles's legacy for French monarchy was teaching his successors exactly what not to do, though the lesson, "don't go mad," isn't particularly actionable advice. Future French kings would remember Charles VI as a cautionary tale about the fragility of absolute power, the dangers of unchecked noble ambition, and the importance of having functional regency systems when the monarch becomes incapacitated. Charles VII, who finally restored French power after his father's death, spent his reign building governmental institutions that could function without complete royal involvement, essentially learning from his father's negative example. The pragmatic sanction of Bourges, reforms to military structure, and establishment of more professional bureaucracy all stemmed partly from Charles VII's childhood, watching his father's court descend into chaos. So Charles VI's contribution to French governance was teaching everyone that maybe concentrating all power in one person's hands was dangerous, when that person could spontaneously decide they were made of glass, though actually implementing systemic changes to address this problem would take centuries and several more catastrophically incompetent monarchs before France finally gave up on absolute monarchy entirely. The medical community's failure to help Charles spawned alternative explanations that ranged from creative to completely insane, because when official medicine fails spectacularly, people start looking for answers elsewhere. Astrologers blamed unfavorable planetary alignments, suggesting Charles's birth chart predestined him for madness, which is convenient because it can't be disproven and requires no actual medical intervention beyond waiting for better cosmic conditions. Alchemists proposed that Charles's glass delusion represented a mystical truth, that he was undergoing spiritual transformation into a higher form of being, which sounds profound until you realize it meant telling a suffering man that his debilitating mental illness was actually enlightenment. Folk healers suggested witchcraft, leading to periodic witch hunts where accused witches were tortured into confessing they'd cursed the king, then executed, after which Charles remained mad, proving either that they'd targeted the wrong witches or possibly that the whole witchcraft explanation was nonsense. These alternative explanations persisted alongside official medical treatment, creating a confused therapeutic landscape where Charles might be bled by physicians in the morning, prayed over by priests at noon, have his astrological chart analyzed in the afternoon, and have protective amulets placed in his chambers at night, a comprehensive approach to treatment that was comprehensively useless. The practical logistics of moving Charles between royal residences during his delusion required elaborate planning that would make modern event coordinators weep with sympathetic stress. Entire routes had to be surveyed and prepared, with padding installed in traveling carriages, roads cleared of obstacles that might cause jolting, and advance teams sent to prepare accommodations at the destination. Charles's travel party included not just normal royal attendants, but specialists trained in managing his specific delusions, medical staff prepared for potential episodes, and enough backup supplies of padded clothing and iron reinforcements to outfit a small army. Moving the Glass King from Paris to another chateau might take days longer than normal because the procession moved at a crawl to avoid jostling that might trigger panic, turning royal progresses into bizarre slow-motion parades where the central figure believed he might shatter at any moment. Local populations along the route would gather to watch their king pass, seeing not the majestic figure of royal propaganda, but a man in strange padded clothing, moving carefully, surrounded by anxious attendants, a living symbol of their kingdom's dysfunction. These journeys must have been humiliating for Charles during any lucid moments, knowing that his condition was being displayed for public observation, unable to present the powerful royal image expected of medieval monarchs. Charles's diet during his mad periods became another source of elaborate accommodation, because feeding someone who thinks their glass presents unique challenges medieval cooks never trained for. Food had to be soft enough that chewing wouldn't create vibrations Charles feared might crack him, presented on cushioned surfaces to avoid loud plate sounds, and served at precise temperatures because extreme heat or cold might supposedly affect his glass composition. Royal chefs, trained to create elaborate medieval feasts, found themselves making essentially baby food for a grown king, pureeing meats and vegetables into textures that wouldn't require vigorous chewing. During some episodes, Charles refused to eat entirely, convinced that the digestive process might somehow damage his fragile structure, requiring attendants to coax him into consuming enough to survive while he fretted about internal breakage. The royal kitchens, normally producing hundreds of dishes for elaborate court banquets, devoted enormous resources to creating specialized meals for one man's delusion, another example of how Charles's condition warped every aspect of palace life. Mealtimes became theatrical productions where everyone pretended that yes, the king requiring pureed food because he thinks his glass is completely normal and not at all a sign that maybe this whole monarchy thing isn't working out. The intelligence gathering about Charles's condition by foreign powers reveals medieval espionage trying to determine just how mad the French king actually was versus how much was exaggeration. English spies infiltrated the French court, trying to observe Charles directly and report back whether the glass delusion was genuine or some elaborate French trick, because apparently even medieval intelligence agencies struggled to believe anyone could actually think they were made of glass. Burgundian agents monitored Charles's episodes to time political moves for maximum advantage, essentially using their king's mental health as a strategic resource to exploit. Ambassadors' reports back to their home countries contained detailed observations of Charles's behavior, reading like clinical notes written by untrained observers trying to describe something they'd never encountered before. These intelligence reports, preserved in various European archives, provide some of our best documentation of Charles's actual condition, because foreign observers had less reason to exaggerate or minimize than French chroniclers with political agendas. The fact that multiple independent sources all confirmed the glass delusion suggests it was genuine, not propaganda, meaning France's enemies knew exactly how vulnerable French leadership was and planned their strategies accordingly, turning Charles's mental illness into a geopolitical intelligence asset for everyone except France. The question of whether Charles had any insight into how his madness was destroying France haunts historians trying to understand his subjective experience. During lucid periods, Charles clearly grasped that his kingdom was collapsing, that his condition enabled the chaos, and that he was powerless to fix it despite being theoretically the most powerful person in France. Did he understand, during his glass delusion periods, that his belief was irrational, experiencing some terrible dual consciousness where part of him knew the truth but couldn't override the delusion? Or was the delusion complete, a total conviction that he was actually glass, making his fear and paralysis entirely logical within his delusional framework? Medieval sources don't provide this psychological depth because medieval chroniclers weren't trained in introspective analysis and didn't think to ask or record such nuances. Modern readers want to understand Charles's internal experience. Was he trapped watching himself behave irrationally? Or did the delusion provide its own terrible logic that made sense from inside the experience? We'll never know, but the question matters because it determines whether Charles's suffering was the horror of watching himself be mad or the horror of genuinely believing he might shatter. And honestly, both options are nightmare fuel that makes his 30-year ordeal even more tragic. The anniversary commemorations of Charles's coronation became increasingly awkward celebrations as his reign progressed, and everyone had to pretend that yes, they were definitely honoring a successful monarchy and not a catastrophic failure enabled by mental illness. These events required courtiers to gather, toast the king's health, and celebrate his reign while Charles stood motionless in reinforced clothing or refused to attend entirely, because crowds might accidentally bump into him and cause shattering. Speeches praising the king's wisdom and leadership had to be delivered with straight faces by nobles who spent the rest of the year working around Charles's complete inability to provide wisdom or leadership, creating cognitive dissonance so severe it probably caused psychological damage to anyone paying attention. The French court developed remarkable skills in diplomatic dishonesty during these celebrations, learning to say things like the king's thoughtful consideration of state matters when they meant the king has been standing in one spot for 6 hours convinced he's glass. These anniversary celebrations became less frequent as Charles's reign dragged on, and maintaining the fiction became too exhausting even for medieval political theater, eventually reduced to perfunctory acknowledgments that yes, technically France still had a king, even if that king was functionally a very expensive statue with a pulse. The inheritance disputes triggered by Charles's condition and the Treaty of Troyes created legal tangles that lasted decades after his death, because apparently giving away a kingdom while mentally incompetent doesn't create clear legal precedent. English lawyers argued that Charles's signature on the treaty was valid regardless of his mental state because he was still legally king, while French lawyers argued that a mad king couldn't consent to anything, creating a fascinating legal debate about capacity, consent, and sovereignty that neither side could win definitively. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by his own mad father and allegedly adulterous mother, had to spend years fighting to reclaim legitimacy that should have been his birthright, essentially suing to undo his parents' decisions made under duress, coercion, and mental incapacity. Property disputes, noble titles, and territorial claims all reference the Treaty of Troyes, meaning Charles VI's mad signature continued affecting French politics and law long after he died. His incompetent decisions preserved in legal documents that took decades to untangle. The whole situation demonstrated that medieval legal systems had no good procedures for handling mentally incompetent monarchs, instead treating their decisions as valid regardless of capacity, which is basically like enforcing contracts signed by someone having a psychotic episode and calling it legitimate because they technically held the pen. Charles's religious observance during his mad periods wavered between fervent devotion and complete inability to participate in church services, creating theological puzzles about whether a mad king could receive sacraments. Priests debated whether Charles's glass delusion prevented him from properly receiving communion. Could someone who believed they were glass truly understand transubstantiation? The doctrine that bread and wine become Christ's body and blood? Some clergy argued that mental illness didn't affect the validity of sacraments as long as proper forms were followed, while others worried that administering communion to someone who might not comprehend what was happening bordered on sacrilege. Charles reportedly had periods of intense religious fear, convinced that his condition was divine punishment and desperately seeking forgiveness for sins he might not have actually committed, creating heartbreaking scenes where a mentally ill man begged God to cure him while priests offered prayers they knew were useless. Other times, Charles couldn't participate in religious services at all, either unable to leave his chambers or too delusional to follow liturgy, meaning France's anointed king, supposedly God's representative on earth, couldn't even attend church like an ordinary parishioner, which rather undermined the whole divine right of king's theology. The impact on French literature and intellectual life during Charles's reign was profound, as writers and thinkers grappled with questions about reason, madness, and political legitimacy that their king embodied. University debates at Paris included discussions of whether a mad king retained royal authority, whether subjects owed obedience to an incompetent ruler, and what limitations should exist on monarchical power when the monarch couldn't exercise it responsibly, basically stumbling into Enlightenment political philosophy centuries early because their king thought he was glass. These discussions had to be carefully phrased to avoid treason charges, with scholars using hypothetical examples and classical precedents rather than directly referencing Charles, creating academic discourse that was obviously about their current situation but technically about abstract principles. The period produced surprisingly progressive political theory about consent, capacity, and the social contract between rulers and ruled, all inspired by watching their government collapse around a mad king, proving that sometimes profound philosophical insights emerge from trying to rationalize completely insane situations. French intellectual life during Charles's reign demonstrated that you can produce great political theory about proper governance while simultaneously doing nothing to actually fix your broken government, a tradition that continues in academic circles to this day. The servants who spent decades managing Charles's delusion developed what we now recognize as professional caregiver burnout, though medieval people lacked the vocabulary to describe the psychological toll of providing care that never improves anything. These attendants watched Charles suffer for years, knew their efforts only managed symptoms rather than addressing causes, and had to maintain emotional composure while participating in elaborate theater everyone knew was fake. Some servants spent their entire adult lives in service to Charles's madness, entering palace employment as young people and leaving as elderly attendants who devoted decades to accommodating one man's psychiatric condition without seeing improvement. The turnover rate among Charles's personal attendants was reportedly high, with people requesting transfers to other duties or leaving palace service entirely, unable to handle the psychological strain of treating a grown man like breakable glass day after day, year after year. Those who remained deserve recognition as unsung heroes of medieval caregiving, though medieval sources barely mention them because apparently only nobles' suffering mattered enough to document. These servants' experience anticipates modern discussions about caregiver stress, compassion fatigue, and the emotional labor of providing care for chronic conditions, proving that some aspects of human experience transcend historical periods even when the specific conditions change dramatically. The military commanders who had to defend France, while their commander-in-chief was convinced he was glass, developed creative interpretations of following royal orders that essentially meant ignoring the king entirely. Generals would obtain theoretical approval from Charles during lucid moments for military campaigns, then conduct those campaigns according to their own judgment regardless of what Charles said or did subsequently, using his initial approval as legal cover for complete operational independence. When Charles was too delusional to even provide theoretical approval, commanders would claim they were acting on previous orders, were responding to emergencies that required immediate action, or were following the king's obvious intentions even when the king's obvious condition was believing he was breakable. This creative interpretation of military chain of command allowed French forces to function despite having no functional commander-in-chief, though it also meant generals operated with dangerous independence and sometimes pursued contradictory strategies that undermined each other. The English must have been simultaneously grateful for French military confusion and slightly concerned about fighting an enemy whose lack of central command made them unpredictable, like playing chess against someone who isn't following any consistent strategy because their king piece believes it's made of glass and refuses to move. Charles's relationship with physical touch and human contact during his glass delusion represents one of the most poignant aspects of his condition, as he was effectively isolated in a bubble of fear within a palace full of people. Humans need physical contact for psychological well-being. Touch is fundamental to emotional regulation, social bonding, and mental health. Yet Charles spent years actively avoiding all physical contact, convinced it would destroy him. His wife couldn't embrace him, his children couldn't hug him, his friends couldn't offer comforting touch during his obvious distress, creating profound emotional isolation that likely worsened his overall mental state. Some attendants reported that during rare moments when Charles allowed touch, usually during transitions between delusional and lucid states, he would weep, suggesting he understood on some level what his condition was costing him in human connection. The tragedy of someone desperate for human contact but terrified of it because of delusional beliefs creates a kind of psychological torture where Charles's own mind imprisoned him in isolation more effective than any physical cell. Modern research on touch deprivation suggests Charles's lack of physical contact probably exacerbated his mental health problems, creating a vicious cycle where the symptoms of his illness prevented the human connection that might have helped him cope with that illness. The economic infrastructure maintaining Charles's Glass King lifestyle was staggering, consuming resources that could have funded armies, built infrastructure, or fed starving peasants during plague and war. Specialized craftsmen manufactured his reinforced clothing, requiring custom tailoring with iron rods carefully sewn into garments that had to be replaced frequently as Charles wore them out or as his delusions demanded modifications. Palace modifications, padding, reinforced furniture, special safe rooms, required construction crews, and ongoing maintenance, employing dozens of workers whose skills were devoted entirely to accommodating one man's psychiatric condition. The administrative apparatus documenting Charles's condition, treatments, and daily life employed scribes, record keepers, and physicians who produced thousands of pages of records that survive in archives today, representing enormous investments of labor in documenting madness rather than addressing it. Historians have attempted to calculate the total cost of managing Charles's condition, and while exact figures are impossible given medieval record-keeping, estimates suggest France spent what would be millions of modern dollars annually just maintaining the infrastructure of the Glass King's delusion. This money came from peasant taxation during one of French history's most difficult periods, meaning ordinary people paid to maintain elaborate accommodations for royal madness, while their own villages burned in civil war, which is basically the most feudalism thing ever, taxing the poor to fund the rich's problems while claiming it's all divinely ordained. The parallel between Charles's personal fragility delusion and France's actual political fragility during his reign is almost too perfect, suggesting either poetic historical irony or that human psychology sometimes produces metaphors that perfectly capture objective reality. Charles believed he was fragile and could shatter at any moment, while France actually was fragile and nearly shattered into component territories controlled by England and Burgundy. His delusion about needing reinforcement and protection matched France's actual need for strong governance and institutional support that his madness prevented. The glass metaphor, beautiful, valuable, functional, but catastrophically fragile, could describe both Charles's self-conception and France's geopolitical situation, making his madness a kind of unconscious commentary on his kingdom's condition. Whether Charles's mind somehow registered France's vulnerability and expressed it through his personal delusion, or whether this parallel is complete coincidence, remains unknowable, but fascinating for what it suggests about connections between personal psychology and political context. The Glass King's delusion perfectly symbolized his kingdom's actual fragility, creating a historical metaphor so apt that if it appeared in fiction, readers would complain it was too on the nose and unrealistic. Yet history delivered it anyway, because apparently reality doesn't care about subtlety in symbolism. The question of what might have helped Charles, viewed through modern psychiatric understanding, is both fascinating and heartbreaking because we know now that effective treatments existed in theory, but were centuries away from being discovered or implemented. Antipsychotic medications, cognitive behavioral therapy, and modern institutional support systems might have managed Charles's symptoms, possibly giving him quality of life and maybe even allowing some level of functional governance with proper accommodations. The tragedy is that Charles suffered for 30 years with a condition that, while still serious in modern times, is treatable to a degree medieval medicine couldn't imagine, making his story a reminder of how much human suffering throughout history stemmed from simple lack of knowledge rather than malice or inevitability. Of course, modern psychiatric care has its own problems: access, stigma, medication side effects, institutional failures. So we shouldn't romanticize contemporary treatment too much. But the gap between what Charles endured and what modern care could have offered is vast enough to make his suffering seem especially senseless. He was born too early, in the wrong century, with a condition his society couldn't understand or treat, and as a result, both he and his kingdom suffered for decades in ways that might have been prevented or minimized with knowledge that would emerge only centuries after his death. The diplomatic incidents caused by Charles's condition range from merely awkward to catastrophically offensive, as foreign envoys discovered that negotiating with a king who thought he was glass required psychological flexibility most ambassadors lacked. One Castilian delegation reportedly waited 3 weeks for an audience with Charles, only to find him standing motionless in a corner, unable or unwilling to acknowledge their presence, forcing them to conduct negotiations with ministers while pretending this was normal diplomatic protocol. German princes sent to discuss marriage alliances had to communicate through intermediaries because Charles couldn't participate in face-to-face meetings without panicking about potential contact, turning straightforward negotiations into bizarre games of telephone where proposals passed through 6 people before reaching a king who might not understand them anyway. The Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador allegedly returned home and reported that France was ungovernable, not because of military weakness or economic problems, but because their king was literally insane and nobody seemed willing to acknowledge this fundamental fact. These diplomatic failures had real consequences. Alliances that might have helped France went unnegotiated, trade agreements stalled, and France's international reputation suffered as word spread that their monarch was non-functional, making the kingdom appear weak and vulnerable to opportunistic neighbors who saw Charles's condition as an invitation to predatory diplomacy. The role of Queen Isabeau during Charles's worst periods remains one of history's most contested questions, with interpretations ranging from a suffering victim doing her best to manipulative villain who deliberately kept him mad, depending on which historian you ask and what their feelings about powerful medieval women are. Isabeau took on unprecedented authority for a French queen, essentially governing during Charles's incapacitation, making her a target for every political faction that opposed her decisions, each claiming she was acting improperly or taking advantage of the king's condition. The accusations of adultery with Louis of Orleans, whether true or fabricated by enemies, served to undermine her political authority by suggesting she was immoral and untrustworthy, because apparently medieval political discourse involved destroying women's reputations when you couldn't defeat their policies. Her decision to sign the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting her own son, was either forced by circumstance and Burgundian pressure or a calculated betrayal, depending on interpretation, though judging someone's choices made under literal siege conditions seems unfair regardless. Isabeau survived Charles by 13 years, dying in 1435 having witnessed her husband's madness destroy France, her son eventually reclaim it, and her own reputation thoroughly shredded by chroniclers who needed someone to blame for the disaster. Modern historians increasingly view her sympathetically as someone who did what she could in an impossible situation, though the historical record remains contradictory enough that we'll never know for certain whether she was hero, villain, or most likely, a complex human being who made imperfect decisions under extraordinary pressure while everyone judged her more harshly than they judged the actual Mad King. The Festival of Fools and other carnivalesque celebrations during Charles's reign took on darkly ironic overtones, as common people celebrated ritual inversions of social order, while their actual king was inverted from powerful ruler to helpless victim of his own delusions. These festivals traditionally involved temporary reversals, peasants mocking nobles, mock kings crowned for a day, deliberate absurdity celebrated. But the joke became less funny when France's real king was effectively a parody of kingship, unable to perform basic royal functions. Some contemporary observers noted the uncomfortable parallels between festival mockery and actual reality, where the temporary Mad King of Carnival was arguably more functional than their permanent Mad King in the palace. The dark humor of these festivals must have provided some psychological relief for ordinary people watching their country collapse, allowing them to laugh at authority that had failed them so spectacularly. Though laughing too loudly or too specifically about the king's condition could still result in punishment for sedition. Medieval carnival humor about mad kings and incompetent rulers became documentary realism during Charles's reign, proving that sometimes reality is stranger and darker than satire, and that societies need ritual spaces to process collective trauma especially when, that trauma is caused by the very authorities carnival is mocking. Charles's experience of time during his delusional periods must have been profoundly distorted, creating a subjective reality where 3 decades passed, but perhaps felt like disconnected moments of terror interrupted by brief periods of clarity. During glass delusion episodes, Charles reportedly couldn't perceive time normally, experiencing each moment as immediate threat requiring constant vigilance against shattering, which would make hours feel like eternities of sustained fear. His lucid intervals, knowing they would end, must have felt desperately short even when they lasted weeks, creating temporal experience where most of his life felt endless while the only bearable parts rushed past too quickly. This distorted time perception means Charles's 30-year reign felt different to him than to his subjects. They experienced 3 decades of political chaos, while he experienced timeless terror punctuated by moments of devastating clarity about what his condition had cost. Modern psychiatric research on time perception and psychotic disorders suggests Charles probably had little sense of how long his episodes lasted, whether his delusions had been present for hours or months, creating additional disorientation beyond the delusions themselves. The tragedy of someone losing not just their grip on reality but their ability to track time passing means Charles may have experienced his reign as a kind of eternal present of fear and confusion, making his suffering qualitatively different from normal human experience of duration and change. The succession anxiety that plagued the French court centered on whether Charles's condition was hereditary and whether his children might develop similar madness, creating pressure on the Dauphin Charles to prove his own mental stability before claiming the throne. The young Charles grew up aware that everyone was watching him for signs of his father's condition, evaluating his behavior for early indicators of madness, turning his entire childhood and adolescence into a continuous psychological evaluation by anxious courtiers. This surveillance must have been psychologically damaging in its own right. Imagine knowing that every unusual behavior, every emotional outburst normal for a teenager, would be interpreted as potential madness by people determining whether you were fit to rule. The Dauphin had to perform sanity constantly, demonstrating through exaggerated rationality and control that he wasn't his father, creating pressure that could have triggered actual mental health problems in someone less resilient. When Charles VII finally became king after his father's death, his relatively successful reign, with Joan of Arc's help, reassured France that madness hadn't become a permanent royal trait, though the anxiety about hereditary insanity influenced French succession politics for generations. The whole situation demonstrates how mental illness stigma affects not just the person suffering, but their entire family, creating genetic determinism fears that persist even when most people don't develop the same conditions as their relatives. The role of Joan of Arc in eventually salvaging France from the disaster of Charles VI's reign adds another layer of irony to this story. As a teenage peasant girl with her own visions and voices accomplished what 3 decades of noble politics under a mad king had failed to achieve. Joan appeared claiming divine guidance to help the Dauphin Charles reclaim France, which must have caused some cognitive dissonance. Were her visions legitimate divine intervention, or was she experiencing something similar to Charles VI's delusions? The fact that France, traumatized by decades of a king whose visions told him he was glass, then rallied behind a girl whose visions told her to lead armies, is either divine irony or historical evidence that context matters more than content when evaluating claims of supernatural guidance. Joan's visions inspired military victories and political reunification, while Charles VI's delusions destroyed French unity, suggesting that maybe the functional outcome of one's psychological experiences matters more than whether those experiences match consensus reality. Of course, Joan was eventually burned as a heretic, proving that medieval people couldn't consistently distinguish between legitimate divine inspiration and dangerous delusion, instead making determinations based on political convenience and military success. The parallel between Charles VI and Joan of Arc, both experiencing non-consensus reality, one destroying France and one saving it, suggests history judges madness by its consequences rather than its symptoms, which is probably appropriate for political history, but somewhat tragic as human understanding. The medical bills from 3 decades of failed treatments for Charles's condition would have been staggering if medieval physicians had billed like modern specialists, though fortunately for the French treasury, most court physicians were on salary rather than fee-for-service. These physicians tried everything their training suggested: bloodletting, purgatives, special diets, herbal remedies, prayers, amulets, astrological timing of treatments, and various combinations thereof, creating a comprehensive record of medieval medicine's complete inability to address serious psychiatric conditions. Each failed treatment led to new theories about why it didn't work and what should be tried next, creating an endless loop of hypothesis, failure, and revision that never actually helped Charles but kept physicians employed. Modern readers might mock medieval medical ignorance, but it's worth remembering that psychiatric care remained largely ineffective until the mid-20th century, meaning Charles's doctors weren't uniquely incompetent so much as working within a paradigm that couldn't possibly succeed. The real failing wasn't trying treatments that didn't work. Experimentation is how medicine advances, but rather never acknowledging that nothing was working and perhaps different approaches were needed, instead doubling down on humoral theory and divine causation for 30 years while their patient continued suffering. This inability to recognize systemic failure and fundamentally revise approach characterizes not just medieval medicine, but many human institutions that prefer doubling down on failed strategies over admitting their entire framework might be wrong. Charles's dreams during his mad periods, if documented, would provide fascinating insight into how delusions manifest in unconscious mental states. But medieval chroniclers apparently didn't think to record the Mad King's dreams for posterity, robbing us of potentially illuminating psychological data. Did Charles dream he was glass even while sleeping, experiencing nightmares about shattering? Or did his sleeping mind provide temporary relief from waking delusions, giving him hours of normal experience before waking to renewed terror? Modern sleep research suggests that psychotic symptoms often diminish during REM sleep, meaning Charles might have had nightly respites from his glass delusion, making waking up each morning a fresh trauma as the delusion reasserted itself. If his attendants noticed him sleeping peacefully, moving normally, without the rigid control he maintained while awake, it must have been simultaneously reassuring. Proof that some part of Charles remained intact, and heartbreaking. Evidence that his true self was trapped behind waking delusions he couldn't escape. The question of whether mentally ill people find refuge in sleep or whether their conditions pursue them even into unconsciousness remains relevant for modern psychiatric patients, making Charles's undocumented dream life a lost opportunity to understand how medieval minds experienced the boundary between waking delusion and sleeping consciousness. The question of whether Charles should have been removed from power through some formal mechanism represents one of history's great hypotheticals. Would France have been better off with a forced abdication, regency, or some other solution? Medieval political theory provided no legitimate path for removing an anointed king who hadn't died or voluntarily abdicated, creating a legal impossibility that trapped France with an incompetent ruler for 3 decades. The divine right of kings meant Charles's authority came from God, and who were mere mortals to override divine will just because the divinely chosen king thought he was glass. This theological trap meant that even as everyone acknowledged Charles couldn't rule effectively, no legitimate process existed to replace him without triggering succession crises that might be worse than the status quo. Modern constitutional monarchies learned from disasters like Charles's reign that you need succession mechanisms for incapacity, creating regency protocols and occasionally even forced abdications when monarchs can't perform their duties. Charles's reign taught political theorists that absolute monarchy with no safety valve for incompetence is catastrophically fragile, though this lesson took centuries to fully implement and required additional disasters before Europeans finally acknowledged that maybe giving one person absolute power with no override mechanisms was poor governmental design. The whole situation demonstrates how theoretical political purity, keeping the divinely anointed king in place no matter what, produced practical disaster, a lesson relevant for any system that prioritizes ideological consistency over functional outcomes. The daily routine of palace life during Charles's madness created its own rhythm and rituals, with everyone's schedule organized around managing the king's delusions and unpredictable lucid periods. Mornings began with attendants assessing Charles's mental state. Was he glass today, or was he lucid, determining how the entire palace would function for the next hours or days. During glass delusion periods, protocols activated, padded corridors, careful movements, meals served in specific ways, court business conducted without royal involvement, but with elaborate documentation pretending otherwise. Lucid periods triggered different protocols. Urgent meetings to get royal approval for accumulated decisions, attempts to address backlogged state business, family visits during precious hours when Charles might recognize his own children. The palace staff developed sophisticated systems for managing these transitions, reading Charles's behavior for early indicators of mental state changes, preparing for shifts between functionality and delusion. This created a peculiar institutional knowledge, the specialized expertise of managing a mad king, that had no application anywhere else and couldn't be passed on to future generations because presumably France wouldn't have another glass king. The whole elaborate system represented incredible human adaptability and organizational complexity devoted to maintaining a fundamentally broken governmental structure, proving that people can develop sophisticated solutions to ridiculous problems when the alternative is confronting the fundamental unsustainability of their entire political system. The propaganda value of Charles's condition for England's war effort cannot be overstated, as English chroniclers and pamphleteers transformed the mad French king into proof that God favored England's territorial claims and that France deserved conquest for its sins. English writers portrayed Charles's madness as divine judgment against French resistance to rightful English rule, conveniently ignoring that mental illness is a medical condition rather than cosmic commentary on political legitimacy. Ballads and popular songs mocked the Glass King, circulating through English taverns and markets, turning French tragedy into English entertainment while also serving as morale-building propaganda for continued war effort. Henry V, England's warrior king during this period, explicitly used Charles's incapacity to justify the Treaty of Troyes, arguing that France needed English governance because French leadership had obviously failed under a mad king. This propaganda campaign was remarkably effective. English soldiers fighting in France believed they were bringing order to chaos, civilizing a kingdom too broken to govern itself, making conquest seem like humanitarian intervention rather than naked territorial aggression. The fact that England itself would later have its own mad king, George III, suggests that divine judgment theories about mental illness and political legitimacy were nonsense. But in the 15th century, Charles's condition handed England a propaganda victory that translated into real military and diplomatic advantages that nearly destroyed France as an independent nation. The architectural modifications made to royal residences to accommodate Charles's delusion included some genuinely innovative design solutions that anticipated modern accessibility adaptations, though for completely different reasons. Palace engineers developed cushioned surfaces, padded walls, and impact-absorbing flooring that would later influence hospital and asylum design, accidentally inventing safety features while trying to prevent their king from panicking about shattering. Specialized furniture with rounded edges and soft materials, designed to keep Charles from fearing injury, represented early ergonomic design principles applied to mental health accommodation rather than physical disability. Doorways were widened and modified so Charles could pass through without brushing against frames, anticipating accessibility standards for wheelchair users by centuries. though the motivation was preventing panic rather than enabling mobility. These architectural innovations, born from necessity and desperation, outlived Charles's reign and influenced French building practices for institutional care facilities, proving that sometimes good ideas emerge from terrible situations. The irony is that France developed cutting-edge environmental adaptations for mental health accommodation while completely failing to develop effective medical treatments, succeeding at changing the built environment to suit Charles's delusions while failing to change his mental state to match reality, which is perhaps a metaphor for how it's often easier to modify external circumstances than address internal psychological problems. Charles's relationship with music during his mad periods reveals one of the few consistently positive interventions his caretakers discovered, as musical performances sometimes calmed him when nothing else worked. Court musicians developed specialized repertoires intended to soothe the king without triggering panic. Gentle melodies without sudden dynamic changes, consistent rhythms without surprising accents. Basically medieval proto-music therapy designed through trial and error. Charles reportedly responded positively to certain instruments, particularly strings and woodwinds, while brass instruments and percussion frightened him, possibly because loud sounds felt threatening to someone convinced he was fragile. Musicians learned to read Charles's behavior, adjusting performances in real time based on his reactions, creating responsive therapeutic music centuries before formal music therapy existed as a discipline. These musical interventions didn't cure Charles's delusions, but provided temporary comfort and sometimes extended lucid periods, representing one of the few successful non-medical approaches his caretakers developed. The fact that music helped when bloodletting should have suggested something to medieval physicians about approaching mental illness therapeutically rather than through physical interventions. But apparently that lesson would take several more centuries to learn, meaning Charles benefited from proto-music therapy while simultaneously being subjected to actively harmful medical treatments based on humoral theory. The question of whether Charles experienced happiness during his 30-year ordeal haunts anyone studying his life, as even profoundly mentally ill people have moments of joy and connection despite their suffering. Did Charles experience pleasure during musical performances, satisfaction during lucid periods when he successfully governed, or love when recognizing his family? Or was his existence a virtually unbroken stream of fear, confusion, and despair interrupted only by brief moments of devastating clarity about his condition? Medieval sources don't address this question because chroniclers focused on political events rather than the king's emotional well-being, leaving us to speculate about Charles's subjective quality of life. Modern psychiatric understanding suggests that even people with severe conditions like schizophrenia experience positive emotions and meaningful experiences between episodes, meaning Charles probably wasn't in constant misery despite the tragedy of his overall situation. The fact that he lived to 53 suggests some will to survive, some experiences worth living for, though chronic mental illness often continues despite suffering rather than because life feels worth living. Whether Charles's life contained enough positive experiences to justify its continuation, or whether he endured decades of predominantly negative experience, remains unknowable but ethically significant for how we understand his story. Is this a tragedy about suffering that happened to include some good moments, or a life that contained both profound suffering and genuine human experiences worth having? The impact of Charles's reign on French national identity was paradoxically both devastating and galvanizing, as the disaster of the Glass King eventually provoked reactions that strengthened French unity and determination. The nadir of French fortunes under Charles VI, kingdom divided, capital occupied, monarch incapacitated, created conditions that made Joan of Arc's rallying cry and Charles VII's eventual victory emotionally and symbolically powerful as national redemption narrative. France's near destruction during Charles VI's reign established a collective trauma and survival story that influenced French self-conception for centuries, creating narratives about resilience, revival, and national character forged through adversity. The fact that France survived the Glass King, recovered from civil war and English occupation, and eventually emerged as a major European power meant Charles's reign became cautionary tale rather than nation-destroying catastrophe, though this outcome was far from inevitable at the time. Modern French historians debate whether to emphasize Charles's reign as disaster or as backstory to eventual triumph, whether the Glass King represents French weakness or context, making subsequent French strength more impressive. The whole situation demonstrates how national identities transform historical trauma into foundational narratives, taking genuine disasters and reinterpreting them as character-building experiences, which works rhetorically but probably provided little comfort to people actually living through Charles's chaotic reign who didn't know France would eventually recover. The servants who witnessed Charles's transition from young, promising king to Mad Glass King over the course of years provide the closest thing to longitudinal observation of his mental decline, though their testimonies are largely lost to history. These attendants watched Charles's first episodes, saw the initial hopeful belief that he would recover, witnessed each subsequent episode eroding that hope, and eventually accepted that their king would never be well. The psychological impact of watching someone's slow mental deterioration, particularly someone you serve and perhaps care about, creates a specific form of anticipatory grief that these servants likely experienced throughout Charles's reign. Long-term attendants developed deep knowledge of Charles's patterns, triggers, and individual quirks that made them invaluable for managing his condition, but also meant they invested years of their lives in work that never improved, helping someone who never got better. Some servants reported feeling affection for Charles despite his condition, seeing the suffering person behind the delusional king, while others became emotionally numb to his plight after years of unchanging crisis. These varying reactions demonstrate normal responses to chronic caregiving stress. Some people maintain compassion indefinitely, while others develop protective emotional detachment, neither response being wrong or right, just different strategies for coping with ongoing exposure to suffering they cannot fix. The servants' experiences, though poorly documented, represent the human cost of Charles's condition beyond just the king himself. The ripples of one person's mental illness affecting dozens or hundreds of other lives in profound, but usually unrecorded ways. Charles's legacy in medical history is peculiarly significant given that his treatment was spectacularly unsuccessful, as his well-documented case provided data for centuries of subsequent medical discussion about delusions, psychosis, and mental illness. Renaissance and early modern physicians referenced Charles VI when discussing similar cases, using his glass delusion as a recognized psychiatric phenomenon even though they couldn't explain or treat it any better than medieval doctors. Philosophers from Descartes onward used the glass delusion as a thought experiment about the nature of knowledge and reality. If someone can be utterly convinced of something false like being made of glass, how can anyone be certain their own perceptions are accurate? Charles's suffering became philosophical example, medical case study, and cautionary tale. His personal tragedy transformed into educational material for people who never knew him and couldn't help him. Modern psychiatry has attempted retroactive diagnosis, with proposals ranging from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder to organic brain disease, though definitive diagnosis is impossible given the limitations of medieval source material and the fact that psychiatric categories themselves are modern constructs that may not perfectly map onto historical cases. The fact that Charles's case remains medically interesting 6 centuries later demonstrates both the timeless nature of mental illness and the relatively recent development of effective psychiatric treatment. As most of human history featured cases like Charles's, well-documented suffering with no effective interventions, just elaborate descriptions of conditions physicians couldn't actually help. The theological debates sparked by Charles's condition about divine providence, human free will, and the meaning of suffering represent some of medieval Christianity's most sophisticated attempts to reconcile religious belief with obvious injustice. If God was benevolent and all-powerful, why would he allow a king, his anointed representative, to suffer decades of madness that destroyed thousands of lives? Theologians proposed various explanations. Charles's suffering was punishment for his sins or France's collective sins. It was a test of faith. It served mysterious divine purposes humans couldn't comprehend, or possibly it demonstrated that even kings were subject to earthly afflictions as reminders of human mortality. None of these explanations were satisfying, though, because they required believing either that God was punishing an entire nation for unclear reasons or that infinite divine wisdom included plans involving decades of preventable suffering. Some more progressive theologians quietly suggested that maybe not everything that happened reflected direct divine will, that God allowed natural processes, including illness, to operate without constant intervention, accidentally stumbling toward more naturalistic understandings of disease. These theological debates, sparked by one mad king, influenced broader medieval discussions about theodicy, providence, and the relationship between divine and natural causation, making Charles's reign philosophically productive even as it was politically disastrous. The fact that brilliant minds spent enormous intellectual energy explaining why God allowed the Glass King's suffering instead of developing actual medical treatments to alleviate that suffering represents a tragic misallocation of medieval intellectual resources, though it's unfair to judge past societies for not having knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. The counterfactual history of what France might have become without Charles's madness is endlessly fascinating speculation. Would stronger French leadership have prevented English victories, avoided civil war, maintained continental dominance? Or were the structural problems of late medieval France, noble factionalism, economic strain from prolonged war, social tensions from repeated plague outbreaks, too deep for even a competent king to solve? Charles's early reign suggested he might have been an adequate if not brilliant monarch, making his madness genuinely consequential rather than just revealing pre-existing problems. Historical counterfactuals are ultimately unprovable, but the fact that France recovered under Charles VII suggests that leadership mattered, that 30 years of better governance might have prevented the nadir of French fortunes during Charles VI's reign. Alternatively, perhaps Charles's madness was merely the most visible symptom of broader French dysfunction, and someone else would have failed differently if Charles had remained sane, producing alternative disasters we can't imagine because they didn't happen. What's certain is that Charles's condition created opportunities for chaos that enemies and rivals exploited, meaning even if his madness didn't cause all of France's problems, it definitely made solving those problems impossible, creating a leadership vacuum at the worst possible historical moment. The Glass King's reign demonstrates how individual human capacity or incapacity can meaningfully shape historical outcomes, even though broader forces and structures obviously matter too, making his story both a personal tragedy and a significant historical turning point. The parallel development of French institutional resilience during Charles's reign, the bureaucratic systems that learned to function despite royal incapacity, accidentally created governmental innovations that would influence European statecraft for centuries. French ministers developed sophisticated workarounds for absent royal authority, creating councils and administrative procedures that distributed power among multiple officials rather than concentrating it in one person, essentially inventing proto-constitutional mechanisms by necessity rather than theory. These innovations occurred not because anyone believed distributed power was philosophically superior to absolute monarchy, but because absolute monarchy had catastrophically failed when the absolute monarch went mad and nobody could officially acknowledge this failure. The irony is that Charles's greatest legacy to French governance was forcing his government to figure out how to work around him, accidentally demonstrating that kingdoms could function without constant royal involvement if proper administrative structures existed. Later French monarchs would struggle to reclaim the concentrated power their predecessors held before Charles's reign proved such concentration was dangerously fragile, creating ongoing tensions between royal authority and ministerial autonomy that would characterize French government for centuries. Charles's madness inadvertently taught France that governmental systems needed redundancy and distributed decision-making capacity, lessons learned through painful experience rather than political philosophy, proving that sometimes the most important innovations emerge from desperate adaptation to crisis rather than careful planning. The intersection of Charles's personal religious devotion during lucid periods with his complete inability to fulfill his role as God's anointed king created profound spiritual crisis for the monarch himself and theological puzzles for his clergy. Charles reportedly prayed desperately during lucid moments for God to either cure him or take his life, feeling his continued existence was harming France and betraying his sacred duty as king, creating suicidal ideation rooted in religious responsibility rather than simple depression. His confessors faced impossible pastoral challenges. How do you provide spiritual comfort to someone whose divinely appointed role they physically cannot perform, whose suffering serves no discernible purpose, and who watches their sacred duty destroy their kingdom? The theological framework of divine right monarchy offered no good answers, just platitudes about mysterious divine plans and suffering as spiritual refinement, which must have felt hollow to Charles watching France collapse around him. Some clergy apparently told Charles that his suffering was redemptive, that by bearing his cross of madness, he was performing valuable spiritual service, which is either profound theological insight or cruel gaslighting, depending on your perspective, though it probably provided little comfort to a man who wanted to be a functional king rather than a living martyr. The whole situation demonstrates how religious frameworks designed to provide meaning and comfort in suffering can fail when that suffering is chronic, purposeless, and actively harmful to others, creating spiritual crises that theological language struggles to address adequately. The black humor that must have circulated among palace staff and common people about their glass king represents a form of gallows comedy that helped people cope with absurd tragedy. Jokes about handling the king with care, or the king who couldn't throw stones because he lived in a glass house, or similar dark puns probably circulated despite the danger of treason charges if such humor became too public or explicit. Medieval people had sophisticated gallows humor traditions. Living with constant death from plague, war, and famine required psychological mechanisms to process horror through laughter, and Charles's reign provided ample material for such coping mechanisms. The gap between official propaganda about the king's wisdom and majesty versus the reality of a man standing motionless in reinforced clothing convinced he might shatter created cognitive dissonance that comedy could release, allowing people to acknowledge through humor what they couldn't acknowledge formally. Modern psychological research on humor in traumatic situations suggests that such dark comedy serves important mental health functions, providing emotional release and creating social bonds through shared recognition of absurdity, meaning the French people's hypothetical jokes about their glass king weren't disrespectful, but rather psychologically necessary. The fact that we don't have recorded examples of this humor, because who would document treasonous jokes, doesn't mean it didn't exist, just that medieval record-keeping focused on official narratives rather than the gallows humor that helped ordinary people survive extraordinary dysfunction. Charles's experience of mirrors and reflective surfaces during his glass delusion presents fascinating questions about self-perception and body image in delusional states. Did mirrors reinforce his delusion by showing him what he believed was a glass figure? Or did they create cognitive dissonance by showing obviously flesh-colored skin rather than transparent glass? Medieval sources don't record Charles's reaction to mirrors, leaving us to speculate whether attendants removed mirrors from his presence to avoid triggering panic or whether seeing his reflection provided moments of clarity that the delusion was irrational. Modern research on body dysmorphia and delusional disorders suggests that sensory evidence contradicting delusions often gets reinterpreted to support those delusions rather than challenging them, meaning Charles might have looked at his reflection and seen glass despite the visual evidence of flesh. Alternatively, the glass delusion might have been more about fragility than literal composition. Charles feared he would break like glass rather than believing he was literally made of silica, making mirrors irrelevant to the core delusion. The question of how delusional beliefs interact with contradictory sensory evidence remains relevant for modern psychiatry, making Charles's undocumented relationship with mirrors a lost data point that might have illuminated how psychotic symptoms persist despite obvious evidence they're false, or how human minds can maintain beliefs that direct observation should disprove. The evolution of Charles's delusion over time, from the initial 1392 breakdown through various symptoms to the persistent glass delusion, suggests his condition progressed or changed rather than remaining static, though medieval sources don't provide the detailed chronology modern psychiatrists would need for proper differential diagnosis. Early episodes involved not recognizing family, believing he wasn't king, and violent outbursts, while later periods focused more on the glass delusion and paralyzed immobility, possibly indicating the condition's natural progression or the effects of aging and repeated episodes. Some historians suggest Charles's symptoms worsened over time as his overall physical health declined, creating a feedback loop where mental and physical deterioration reinforced each other, making his final years worse than his initial episodes. Other scholars argue the glass delusion represented a kind of stabilization, certainly preferable to violent episodes where he attacked people, that allowed some management of his condition even if it didn't represent improvement. The question of whether Charles's condition progressed, stabilized, fluctuated, or followed some other trajectory matters for understanding what he actually suffered from, though the incomplete medieval records make definitive answers impossible. What's clear is that 3 decades is a very long time to suffer with severe mental illness, and the Charles who died in 1422 had endured more than half his life in psychiatric crisis, making him one of history's longest documented cases of persistent psychotic disorder, a tragic record nobody would want to hold. The impact on medieval concepts of personal identity and the self caused by Charles's condition, a person who sometimes was and sometimes wasn't recognizably himself, challenged philosophical assumptions about continuous personal identity. When Charles didn't recognize his family, claimed he wasn't king, or believed he was glass, was he still himself? Medieval philosophy, heavily influenced by Christian concepts of immortal souls, generally held that personal identity persisted regardless of mental state, but Charles's radical transformations tested this theory practically. His family and courtiers had to navigate relationships with someone who was sometimes the person they knew and sometimes essentially a stranger occupying the same body, raising questions about whether they were interacting with Charles or with his illness. Modern philosophy of personal identity continues grappling with these questions. Is personal identity about continuous memory, consistent character, bodily continuity, or something else? But Charles's case presented these puzzles concretely rather than abstractly centuries before philosophers formalized these debates. The emotional reality for Charles's family was probably simpler and more painful than philosophical abstraction. They knew Charles was still there somewhere during his delusional periods, but couldn't reach him. Watching the person they loved become temporarily inaccessible behind symptoms he couldn't control, creating a peculiar form of grief where you mourn someone who's still alive but not really present. The strategic decisions made by Charles VII after finally claiming his throne reflected lessons learned from watching his father's reign destroy France through governmental absence and noble factionalism. Charles VII centralized military power, reducing noble autonomy that had enabled civil war during his father's madness, essentially learning that distributed power without central coordination produced disaster. He professionalized royal administration, hiring educated bureaucrats loyal to the crown rather than depending on nobles whose factional loyalties superseded national interests, directly addressing problems his father's incapacity had revealed. His reforms to taxation and military organization created state structures that could function regardless of the king's personal capacity, building systemic resilience that his father's reign had demonstrated was desperately needed. Essentially, Charles VII's relatively successful reign represented institutional learning from Charles VI's catastrophic failure, taking the lessons of the Glass King's disaster and building governmental structures designed to prevent similar collapse in future. The tragedy is that these reforms came too late to help Charles VI himself, and the decades of suffering required to teach these lessons cost thousands of lives and nearly destroyed France, making the Glass King's reign a very expensive educational experience that France had to survive before it could learn from. The question of whether Charles's attendants ever seriously discussed mercy killing to end his suffering represents one of history's darkest hypotheticals, though no records suggest this was actually considered or attempted. Medieval Christianity firmly opposed suicide and murder, making euthanasia for even the most suffering individuals theologically unthinkable regardless of practical compassion arguments, meaning Charles's attendants probably never seriously entertained ending his life no matter how much he suffered. The sacred nature of kingship added additional barriers. Killing God's anointed representative would be not just murder, but sacrilege, ensuring that even if someone contemplated mercy killing from compassion, religious and political consequences would prevent action. Modern debates about euthanasia and assisted dying for people with severe psychiatric conditions remain ethically complex, with strong arguments on multiple sides about autonomy, quality of life, and the sanctity of life, making Charles's case a thought experiment about whether chronic, treatment-resistant mental illness that causes immense suffering constitutes grounds for choosing death. Charles reportedly asked God to take his life during lucid periods, suggesting he sometimes wished for death as release from his condition. Though whether that constitutes informed consent for euthanasia or represents suicidal ideation requiring prevention depends on ethical frameworks we're still debating 6 centuries later. The fact that Charles lived to 53 despite decades of suffering means he either never seriously attempted suicide or his attempts were prevented, leaving us uncertain whether his continued life represented his own choice, his attendant's protection, or simply lack of opportunity to end his suffering. The symbolism of glass as Charles's specific delusion rather than, say, porcelain or crystal or some other fragile material reflects late medieval culture's relationship with glass as newly valuable, beautiful, and impossibly fragile. Glass production had recently improved, making clear glass available to wealthy Europeans for the first time in centuries, transforming it from rare Roman technology to contemporary luxury good that symbolized wealth, refinement, and fragility. Charles's delusion that he was made of this specific valuable but fragile material reflected cultural anxieties about nobility's precarious position, beautiful, elevated, valuable, but one wrong move away from destruction, making his delusion a perfect metaphor for aristocratic existence in late medieval France. The glass delusion appeared in multiple documented cases beyond Charles, suggesting it represented a culturally specific manifestation of more universal fears about vulnerability and fragility, shaped by the material culture and symbolic meanings available in that particular historical moment. Modern delusions often incorporate contemporary technology, people believing they're being controlled by radio waves, computers, or surveillance devices, demonstrating how delusional content reflects available cultural materials even though the underlying psychological mechanisms remain consistent. Charles's glass delusion thus tells us something about both his individual psychology and late medieval European culture's symbolic landscape, where glass represented the intersection of beauty, value, and terrifying fragility that perfectly captured both Charles's internal experience and his kingdom's external reality. The educational impact of Charles's reign on future European monarchies manifested in constitutional reforms and succession protocols designed to prevent similar governmental paralysis when rulers became incapacitated. England developed more formalized regency procedures. Spain created councils with explicit authority to govern during royal incapacity, and various German principalities established written protocols for what happened when a prince went mad, all learning from France's decades-long disaster that hoping your king doesn't go insane isn't an adequate governmental strategy. These reforms took centuries to fully implement. Absolute monarchy dies hard, and admitting that kings might need oversight seemed to undermine the entire divine right framework. But Charles's catastrophic reign provided the case study that made such reforms politically imaginable even if initially unpalatable. The irony is that France itself, having suffered most directly from Charles VI's madness, remained relatively slow to implement formal incapacity procedures, perhaps because acknowledging the Glass King's disaster required confronting uncomfortable truths about divine right monarchy that French political culture wasn't ready to address. Charles's legacy thus became strongest in other countries' constitutional development rather than French reforms, his failure teaching lessons his own kingdom struggled to internalize, but neighboring monarchies gratefully learned from, proving that sometimes the best use of a catastrophic example is as warning to others rather than catalyst for self-reform. The pharmaceutical treatments attempted for Charles, various herbal concoctions, mineral preparations, and compounds whose recipes survive in medieval medical texts, represent proto-pharmacology's completely random approach to psychiatric conditions before anyone understood neurotransmitters or brain chemistry. Physicians prescribed mandrake for sedation, hellebore as a purgative supposed to expel melancholic humors, and various other plant-based preparations that ranged from mildly sedating to actively toxic, none with any therapeutic value for psychotic disorders. Some preparations probably made Charles's condition worse through side effects, drug interactions, or toxicity, while others did nothing except give physicians something to prescribe so they felt useful. The fact that some of these herbal treatments have since proven to have actual pharmaceutical properties for other conditions, digitalis from foxglove for heart conditions, for instance, doesn't vindicate medieval psychiatric pharmacology, which was essentially throwing darts blindfolded and declaring victory whenever anything happened regardless of whether it helped. Modern psychopharmacology's development of actual effective psychiatric medications didn't begin until the mid-20th century, meaning Charles's physicians were working 7 centuries before even the theoretical frameworks that enable psychiatric medication existed. The tragedy is less that medieval physicians didn't have effective drugs. How could they? But more that their theoretical framework prevented them from recognizing that their treatments weren't working and maybe different approaches were needed, instead attributing failures to improper dosing, astrological timing, or patient moral failings rather than fundamental misunderstanding of what they were treating. Charles's relationship with his brother Louis of Orleans before the latter's assassination adds another layer of family tragedy to this story. As Louis served as sometime protector and sometime political rival, their relationship complicated by mental illness, political ambition, and possibly romantic entanglement with Charles's wife. During Charles's lucid periods, the brothers apparently maintained affectionate relations, with Louis supporting Charles's attempts to govern and Charles trusting Louis with significant authority. During Charles's mad periods, Louis took power and may have taken sexual liberties with Queen Isabeau, creating a betrayal that Charles in his lucid moments may or may not have known about or been able to address. The assassination of Louis in 1407 by Burgundian agents removed one of the few people who actually tried to govern France rather than simply exploit Charles's incapacity, triggering civil war that made everything exponentially worse. Whether Louis was genuinely trying to help his mad brother while managing an impossible situation or was an opportunist using Charles's condition for personal gain remains historically debated, though the truth was probably more complicated than either extreme characterization. Charles's reaction to Louis's death isn't well documented. Was he lucid enough to grieve his brother, or was he lost in delusion when the news arrived? Leaving us uncertain whether Charles even understood he'd lost his sibling and occasional protector to political murder, adding unknowable private grief to his public dysfunction. The climate during Charles's reign, the tail end of the medieval warm period transitioning toward the Little Ice Age, created additional stressors through agricultural disruption, harvest failures, and weather extremes that exacerbated all of France's other problems. Imagine trying to govern during mental health crisis while also managing crop failures, food shortages, and populations stressed by climate-driven scarcity, except Charles couldn't actually govern, leaving these crises unmanaged while nobles fought each other instead of addressing practical problems. The intersection of personal incapacity, political dysfunction, military conflict, and environmental stress created a perfect storm of cascading failures where each problem made others worse in a feedback loop that nearly destroyed France. Modern understanding of how climate stress affects political stability, migration, and conflict suggests that Charles's reign faced challenges that would have taxed even competent leadership, making his madness especially catastrophic because it removed governmental capacity precisely when that capacity was most desperately needed. The Glass King standing motionless while crops failed, peasants starved, and English armies invaded represents leadership failure at its most complete, where every level of governance simultaneously malfunctioned because the single point of failure, Charles's mental health, took down the entire system that depended on his functional leadership. The letters and documents written in Charles's name during his incapacitated periods, royal proclamations, diplomatic correspondence, legal decisions, represent elaborate forgeries that maintained legal fiction even when everyone knew the king hadn't actually written or approved them. Royal scribes became expert at imitating Charles's signature during lucid periods and applying it to documents he never saw during delusional periods, essentially committing authorized fraud to maintain governmental continuity. Ministers drafted documents in formal royal voice, citing the king's wisdom and careful consideration, knowing Charles was at that moment standing motionless in his chambers, convinced he was glass and completely unaware of the proclamation, supposedly reflecting his royal will. These forged documents survive in archives today, bearing Charles's name and seal, looking exactly like legitimate royal correspondence, but actually representing pure fiction, elaborate performances of governance that substituted for actual governance. Modern archival researchers can sometimes identify these forgeries through dating, documents supposedly written during periods we know Charles was delusional, but many remain indistinguishable from legitimate royal documents, meaning our historical record of Charles's reign includes unknown quantities of fake decisions attributed to a king who made no such decisions. This represents medieval governmental fraud on grand scale, justified by necessity, but fundamentally dishonest, raising questions about how much historical documentation from this period reflects actual royal decision-making versus administrative improvisation attributed to absent royal authority. The question of whether Charles ever fully understood the Treaty of Troyes that gave his kingdom to England, whether he signed during a lucid period comprehending what he was doing or was manipulated during delusion, represents one of history's most consequential questions about informed consent and legal capacity. If Charles was lucid and understood he was disinheriting his son and ceding France to England, the treaty represents legitimate royal decision even if catastrophically poor judgment. If Charles was delusional or coerced, the treaty represents legal fraud, obtaining signature from someone incapable of consent, making it void regardless of proper documentation. Contemporary sources disagree about Charles's mental state during the treaty signing, with French accounts claiming he was too mad to consent and English sources insisting he was perfectly lucid, both sides motivated by obvious political interests in declaring the treaty valid or invalid. Modern legal frameworks recognize that mental incapacity invalidates consent for contracts, marriages, and legal decisions, suggesting the Treaty of Troyes might have been void from the start if Charles truly couldn't understand what he was signing. The fact that France eventually rejected the treaty and Charles VII reclaimed the throne suggests French people considered their mad king's signature under those circumstances non-binding, essentially arguing that you can't give away a kingdom while convinced you're made of glass and expect that gift to be legally enforceable, which seems reasonable even if medieval legal frameworks didn't clearly establish this principle. The servants' testimonies that occasionally survive in trial records and chronicles, depositions about Charles's behavior given for various legal or political purposes, provide the most detailed accounts of what living with his delusion actually looked like day to day. One servant described Charles refusing to pass through doorways for days because he calculated that his glass body was wider than the opening and he would shatter attempting passage, requiring attendants to widen the doorframe before he would move. Another account describes Charles carefully calculating how to sit down, the process taking 15 minutes of cautious lowering while he ensured no sudden impact would crack him, turning the simple act of sitting into an elaborate engineering problem. These mundane details, the practical reality of delusion affecting every basic action, provide insight into Charles's experience beyond political consequences, showing how his condition made ordinary life extraordinarily difficult even beyond the governmental implications. The patience required of attendants to accommodate these elaborate rituals, repeating the same reassurances and procedures day after day for years, represents devotion or at least professional dedication that deserves recognition even if medieval sources barely mention it. These testimonies also reveal that Charles's delusion had its own internal logic. He wasn't randomly afraid but calculated risks according to his delusional framework, showing that even in profound mental illness, human minds maintain some form of coherence even when the premises are completely false. The intersection of Charles's personal tragedy with broader European transformation, the slow death of medieval feudalism and emergence of early modern states, means his reign marked a turning point disguised as a disaster. The governmental innovations forced by his incapacity, the weakening of divine right absolutism that his obvious unfitness for rule demonstrated, and the strengthening of administrative bureaucracy that learned to function without him all contributed to political modernization even though nobody intended these consequences. Charles's reign accidentally taught Europe that governmental systems needed resilience beyond individual leaders, that distributing power created stability, and that maybe placing absolute authority in one person's hands was catastrophically fragile governmental design. These lessons weren't learned immediately or consciously. Most people just reacted to immediate crises without recognizing broader implications. But over centuries, the Glass King's failure contributed to European political development away from pure absolute monarchy toward more distributed power structures. The tragedy is that this positive long-term outcome required enormous short-term suffering, thousands of deaths in civil war and foreign invasion, and decades of governmental dysfunction, making Charles's reign a catastrophically expensive lesson that Europe paid for in blood and treasure before eventually learning something useful from the disaster. Whether this makes his reign somehow valuable for its unintended consequences or simply a tragedy that later people managed to extract lessons from remains debatable, though Charles himself certainly gained nothing from his suffering's eventual educational value to future generations.